What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel for another review. I had to try really hard to put a smile on my face right now because I just saw the film Warfare, directed by Alex Garland. Actually, it's also co-directed by Ray Mendoza. I guess Garland had a really fun time making Civil War last year and decided to go for another war film, only this time he wanted hyper-realism, so he decided to co-direct this one with Mendoza, who is a real-life Navy SEAL and one of the survivors of the event that's being depicted in this film. And this movie is basically a recreation of a grueling mission endured by a platoon of Navy SEALs in Iraq, based solely on the memories from the survivors. War films, they're a piece of art as old as Kino itself. There have been great ones over the many years, there have been bad ones. I know people have generally very strong opinions towards these types of movies, and I don't want to get into the politics behind it, but it's clear if you spend any time on Twitter or Letterboxd, there are people that have very opposing viewpoints on what these films can accomplish, what they should accomplish. But what I will say without a doubt is that all films that depict war exist on a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, you'll find movies like Inglourious Basterds, Tropic Thunder, among many others, that are not meant to be taken seriously in the slightest. They are completely fictional, not remotely believable, and they're not trying to be. Then there's this massive section in the middle populated by films such as Hacksaw Ridge, and there's a ton of others that I just can't pick up off the top of my head right now, but these are movies that probably get a lot of things right, but also take some creative liberties for the sake of making a more clean narrative for general audiences. And finally, there's things like Saving Private Ryan, Zero Dark 30, Dunkirk, war films that are dedicated to crafting a sense of realism above all else. Warfare cozies up right next to those on this far end of that spectrum. When it comes to my personal taste, I think this end of that range is the least interesting when it comes to war films because it just feels like they have the least amount to say, because they don't really dare get into the specifics of their situations because they're just depicting real life events. With that said, there are three things when it comes to the technicality of the movie Warfare that I think are exceptional. The first of which is the sound design, which is absolutely top-notch from start to finish. The first 20 minutes or so are actually very silent. There's not a lot of sound. It's mostly characters talking, and they're keeping their voices to a low level for obvious reasons. But when things do ramp up, Garland does an exceptional job of making every gunshot, every explosion count. And he also does a great job of depicting the tinnitus, the ringing that you would hear when things do quiet down briefly in between all of the chaos. And there's no denying that it looks excellent too. That's the second technical element that I think this film excels at. I like that Garland keeps the action small scale, claustrophobic, and gritty. He doesn't try to go big with it and create spectacle for the sake of spectacle. And I'm sure that having the influence of a real-life Navy SEAL who was in this situation and lived through it, advising him, definitely helps in creating a sense of realism with this depiction. The third technical element here that deserves massive praise is the performances, particularly Joseph Quinn and Cosmo Jarvis. Several members of the team are critically injured by an IED at one point, and their wounds are shown in graphic nature, but it's the continuous screams of agony that really immerse you into the situation. The amount of pain that they're experiencing in this situation is unimaginable, and I think there is a tendency in these types of movies to downplay that a little bit for the sake of not coming off as too bleak, but I don't know, this felt very realistic in the way that it showed that. And when it comes to my problems with Warfare, I think they're pretty consistent with most war movies that find themselves, once again, on the extreme end of that spectrum that I was referring to earlier. We don't really get any introductions to the characters. There are a lot of them. They're not fleshed out. We don't know who they are deep down. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should have gotten a detailed backstory to each one of them, but I found myself so much more attached to the tension of the situation rather than any of the humans experiencing it. And that might just be another one of those things that comes down to personal taste. I myself connect more to a character-driven narrative than a plot-driven narrative. And it's not that I didn't feel sympathy for them, obviously, but if it weren't for these heightened technical elements, I probably wouldn't have been very invested in the true bare bones of what is happening in this movie. And that's where I think it benefits Hollywood to take a few minor creative liberties. I guess you could say something like Saving Private Ryan has a few more dramatized scenes, but it still has that very realistic sense to the combat. And that's really what Warfare is. It is purely a look into the hell of combat, how devastating it is not only to the ones who are physically injured or killed, but also their comrades who are still stuck in this situation and must process what is happening and try to save their friends. It certainly doesn't break any new ground, but if you can stomach the brutality, I think it's worth watching one time to really get into the shoes of what these people experienced. Cue the people who show up every time there's a new war film claiming that it's war propaganda. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of this necessarily, but this movie doesn't glorify war. It doesn't glorify violence. In fact, it does the very opposite of that. It makes me so terrified of being in the shoes of these characters that I have the opposite mindset. Yes, in terms of making direct statements, it's very neutral politically. But once again, this movie's agenda is very clear-cut and dry. It is trying to give us a realistic depiction of this event, and that's all there is to it. I'm gonna give Warfare a very high 3-star rating. It just doesn't quite get to 3.5. I certainly think it's worth a watch for people who enjoy this genre specifically, but clearly I'm not quite as high on it as most other people are. I think I'm in the minority in not loving it. So if you do catch Warfare, be sure to let me know what you think of it down in the comments. Hit that like button as well as subscribe before you head out. I'll catch you guys in the next video. See you later.